Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today is Remembrance Sunday, so we decided that the theme today should be relating to that. And it's an interesting day because some people mention the word incorrectly and call it Armistice Day. Other people also call it Poppy Day, and actually those three names are all very different. For example, Armistice Day never changes. That is the same day every single year, and just like we always remember the year 1066 as the Battle of Hastings, we also remember that the war came to an end on the 11th of November 1918. It's an interesting fact as well because technically the war is still going in 1918. There was an armistice on the 11th of November, but the actual Treaty of Versailles isn't signed until 1919. So really, Armistice Day is the day the fighting actually stops, and that famously is the 11th of November. However, Poppy Day is another date completely, and that's always the Saturday before Remembrance Sunday, and that's in the past been the day when the Royal British Legion and their poppy appeal collectors get out onto the streets and sell vast amounts of poppies, or shall we say get donations for vast amounts of poppies. And the interesting thing about that is the poppy appeal is always launched previous to that in October. So really the collecting starts in October, but really the final ramp up of the donations and the collections actually happen on the Poppy Day. It's been quite sad this year because COVID-19 has actually curtailed a lot of the poppy sellers, and obviously usually walking around the shops on a Saturday of Poppy Day, you usually see lots and lots of people out there, some in military uniform, others wearing medals and selling their poppies. And obviously this year they've encouraged us all to print off one of their posters, and obviously the words are very, very poignant. Every poppy counts, and all I would encourage you to do is make a donation to the Royal British Legion Poppy Appeal, be it buying a poppy if you can get hold of one, or even going online, even on their Facebook and Twitter account, and donating via there. So Remembrance Sunday is a day where people come together for the more religious aspect of the remembrance period. So like I said, we have Armistice Day on the 11th of November, we have the Poppy Day closest to Remembrance Sunday, and famously Remembrance Sundays do alter, they do move, and it's always the closest Sunday to Armistice Day. So this year it was today, and it's an interesting period because people often wonder why the poppy was chosen in the first place. So what we're going to do in this video is give a brief overview of remembrance, and in particular Remembrance Day. Now, many soldiers that came back from the Great War often remembered seeing nothing but browns, greys and blacks. And if you think about it, even though we see black and white images, we all know the colour of mud, for example. We know the colour of rust. And if you think about it, soldiers would have seen that for a very, very long period of time. You would have seen the khaki, you would have seen the colour of mud and clay, the colour of rust in metalwork, and it's all pretty much one colour. But most of the veterans, most of the soldiers often mentioned the fact that strangely poppies grew in the war zone, in the battlegrounds, really in no man's land, and people often saw poppies growing on the top of trench parapets. And the interesting thing is they were blood red, and people often said, isn't it amazing how these poppies are growing in amongst all this death and destruction? And even now, if you try and grow poppies in a garden, you plant them in a pot, for example, they don't do that well. But if you look at waste ground, if you look at building sites, or even ground that's been constantly churned up, poppies love the upheaval and they always grow better. So you can see why poppies grew in the battlegrounds. And then slowly people began to notice this, and we know some soldiers picked the odd poppy and brought them back, often pressing them between books and then sending them home, or taking them home when they came home from the war, or even on leave. But famously, the poppy was adopted because of one man, really, and that was a man called John McCrae, and he actually wrote a poem. Now, this is a copy of the piece of paper that he wrote it on to start with, and like I said, at the end of this video, Helen will read this one out, and it was called In Flanders Fields. And without taking all the emphasis off Helen's poem at the end, it starts with, in Flanders Fields the poppies grow. And obviously the nation looked at that, and because of all these stories about poppies, it was decided that the poppy should be chosen as the symbol of remembrance. And from that date, people wore poppies. Some people wore an actual poppy, other ones actually wore silk ones. Now these are not like the original ones from 1919 and 1920, but these are actually made out of silk. And something you won't notice, I don't think, but in the center of these are quite old ones. These have actually got the original stud that actually states in the middle there, Hague Fund. And that's the interesting thing, because over the years, especially after the Great War, and more so in the 1960s, Field Marshal Haig was often slated. And it's quite sad in a way, because we know at the end of the war, a lot of soldiers respected him. And it sounds a bit odd, and there will probably be people watching this and maybe even commenting, saying that Field Marshal was the butcher, Field Marshal Haig. But the thing was, there was a lot of people that liked him, and he was one of the main leading people that suggested having some form of appeal. And originally it was called the Hague Fund. Slowly they came up with the idea of a mass-produced manufactured poppy. So here we have an early one, and I say an early one because really you can look at the history of the poppy in the poppy appeal by what the poppies look like. And obviously this one doesn't have a little branch coming up like the one I'm wearing today, which stops it coming out when you've got a pin in it. A lot of these now are enamel ones, for example. Some of them are even stickers, and it's pretty faded if you compare it with poppies of today. And I think I got this poppy probably when I was still at school, way back in the late 1980s, early 90s really. And this one also has in the center of the stud the words Hague Fund, and they all had that on originally right up into the 1990s. Nowadays that's been removed, and they've taken Hague's name completely off it, which I think is quite a sad thing, and it now says Poppy Appeal. And that's mainly because some people did think it was wrong to have Hague's name on it in the first place, and it's quite a sad thing, I think. Here's a picture from the 1930s of poppies being manufactured and wreaths being manufactured, and famously these are produced in a factory, the poppy factory, by veterans. And that was the idea initially. It would be veterans, disabled veterans, who would come together and manufacture all these poppies, and it's still done today. And when this COVID crisis disappears, I would encourage you to look them up and maybe go on a visit, because they do have things like open days, for example. Anyway, that brings us up to the 1920s. In 1921, interestingly, we do have the formation of the Royal British Legion, and it's not the only Veterans Society going, because what you have to remember is even before the end of the First World War, there was quite a few regimental organisations. Famously for Worcester, we have the Worcestershire Regimental Association, which then later became the Worcestershire and Sherwood Foresters Regimental Association, and now there is such a thing as the Mercian Regiment Association. So there was a lot of regimental associations, but not a national one. There were organisations as well, for example, the Soldiers, Sailors and Airmen's Fund, SAFA, they've been going for a very, very long time, and also the Army Benevolent Fund. But in 1921, the Royal British Legion came along, and the ultimate aim of that was they wanted to be the custodians, as they still state today, they will be the custodians of remembrance. And that's why when we think of Remembrance Sunday, when we think of Armistice Day, and even Poppy Day, the day when people sell the poppies on the Saturday before, we always think of the Royal British Legion. But like I said, there were other organisations as well. But the Royal British Legion, as I said, were the, and still are, the custodians of remembrance. And what we have to remember is remembrance is not just about the veterans from the First World War and the Second World War. It's veterans from all wars, including more recent conflicts as well. And that's an interesting thing. I'm a member of the Royal British Legion. I'm on the committee for Worcester City branch, and it's quite interesting that when the Legion did a survey about 10 years ago, maybe only about 5 years ago actually, it was quite interesting. When the survey came out, they asked people what the Legion was all about, and most people say veterans from World War One and World War Two. Well, actually, it's veterans from all wars, really. It's not just for the older veterans. They look after endless amounts of people, including those that have just left the services and having problems with post-traumatic stress, for example, and even those with injuries, life-changing injuries from wars such as Afghanistan, in also Northern Ireland and so on. But the Legion has changed slightly over the years. They've modernised, for example. They've kept up with trends. Nowadays, you can buy enamel badges, wristbands, and all sorts of things. And what I will draw your attention to is you have to remember the British Army always has been quite a multicultural force. So the Royal British Legion does actually produce grave markers, or shall we just call them markers, really. And this one is actually for non-faith. So if you think someone hasn't got a faith, or you're not sure, or even if you are not particularly religious, you can actually place a marker down like this one. There's also one for the Muslim religion, as you can see just there. So that can be placed down for that religion. We've also got one for the Hindu religion, as you can see from that one. So as you can see, a multicultural army needing multicultural remembrance. That's the famous one that everyone's seen and heard of before, obviously the Christian cross. And then we've also got the more unusual, that's often not recognised. We have the Sikh badge, just there, and finally the Jewish cross as well. So this just goes to show how the Royal British Legion has changed and how remembrance has changed over the years. And what you have to remember is the 2-minute silence was something that was suggested relatively early on after the end of the Great War. And it was in 1919 that they decided to carry out a true 2-minute silence, which obviously we held at 11 o'clock today. Here is a picture of quite an early remembrance service in London, and obviously it's the famous hollow square for protection to look down at the focal point, which is the cenotaph just there. After the Great War, lots of memorials were actually built. We've got one in Worcester, and you have to remember, war memorials don't always come in the guise of stone, for example. War memorials could be a window, it can be a form of transport. For example, there's a railway engine, a steam engine in the Severn Valley Railway Highley Engine House, which is a war memorial. If you think of the Caval van, the carriage that carried the unknown warrior as well, that's a war memorial. Some people have stained glass windows that are war memorials. War memorials can be absolutely anything. In Worcester itself, we've got a park, Gallivant Park, and that is a war memorial in its own right. Here we have the Guards Memorial in Horse Guards down in London. They take many different shapes and sizes and also materials. This one is obviously a more traditional one. The most famous war memorial, however, is the one that's marking 100 years on the 11th of November, and that is the cenotaph. And it's an interesting name. The word cenotaph is actually from a Greek word that means empty tomb, and it was the ancient Greeks that had this idea because they thought their warriors could be dying all across the known world, and therefore we should remember them with an empty tomb, a tomb that doesn't have anyone in, but it represents the people that have died. And that's why we call this a cenotaph today. The original one was constructed right at the end of the Great War, and it was actually made out of timber and plaster. And then it was decided that this would be a permanent memorial, and famously that was built and was officially opened by the King in 1920. Down in London. So this year will be marking 100 years of the cenotaph officially opening. It's quite sad really, because the 11th of November 1920, not only was this being unveiled, but at the same time the carriage of the unknown warrior went past for its interment really in Westminster Abbey. So hopefully this has given you a little introduction to what remembrance is and how it's changed over the years, and hopefully everyone watching this has held a 2-minute silence at 11 o'clock this morning. But you have to remember, remembrance is not just once a year. It's not just in November. It's not just on the 11th of November, or even the Sunday closest being Remembrance Sunday. Remembrance is something that we should always think about all year round, and it's something that I think about. I know famously some veterans remember a certain day which is particular to them, for example D-Day. So we always have to remember, remembrance is something we have to think about all the time. It's what our freedom, the freedoms that we have got now, is all about, really. There was a lot of people, a vast amount of people, that died for what we have today. Anyway, on that note, stay safe as always, and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders fields.